Hi, my name is Dustin Messer. I am a priest at All Saints Dallas. Once a week or so, we are joined by an outside guest to help us think more clearly about God, His Word, and His world. This week, we are joined by the Dean President of Nashotah House Theological Seminary, Garwood Anderson. Garwood, thank you for being with us.
It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well,
I have heard so much about this church, only visited once before, and thanks be to God for all the good work you do here.
Well, we appreciate you being here. I'm going to ask some questions about atonement, justification, that kind of thing, but before...
Wait, you said you were going to ask me easy questions. Now,
Wait, this is a curveball for
Okay.
you. I know this is the first time you thought about atonement justification, so we'll see what you come up with here.
Right,
But
I feel like I'm in ordination exams now, right?
Before we get there, I do want to hear a little bit about you, how you came to faith in Christ, and maybe
okay.
a little bit about your work at Nashotah.
Sure. I'll try to make it brief. You know, you ask somebody to tell their story, it could go on. I grew up in a really wonderful Christian family, very devout Christian parents, in an evangelical home and setting. I was the fifth child of six, so it was a large family. As I like to say, the most anonymous child in that kind of a family is the second to the last. So 5 of 6, which suited me really well because I had enough introversion that I like to read and think and be on my own, and that happened. And because I always had 7 people around, I never felt lonely, right?
Yeah.
So my parents set a marvelous example. I was brought up in the church. We were always in the church when it was open, Sunday morning, Sunday night, usually something midweek, not to mention home Bible studies and stuff. And none of that did I regret or resent. And as I late teens and early college, you know, I started to have kind of 2 questions about the faith. One was, sociologically, I felt a little alienated from the culture, being evangelical, maybe tending toward fundamentalist, at least our church. And I kind of wondered, like, is this cool enough for me to do? And the second was sort of intellectual, like, do I just believe this because it's the way I was raised? And so at that point, my older brother, I have one brother, he's the oldest in our family, a remarkable, committed Christian through his teenage and college and ever since. Years, he was kind of a ray of light for me to follow. And then my parents set this kind of example that I've said I would have had to stumble so hard over them to leave the Christian faith because of their just God-wrought goodness and the way that they raised us. So all of that to say, I went off to college with those sort of intellectual questions and met people that were smarter than I was, who had thought about them, who turned me to people like, C.S. Lewis and other apologists. And, so I was on that quest to sort of answer questions. But I think fundamentally, it really still did come back to my family life. And I had kind of I never had a conversion experience that I know of. I mean, God might know of one, I don't. But in my freshman year in college, I stayed back for a homecoming weekend. It just turned out I was living with a big man on campus who was the homecoming king that year, whom I much admired, and who could influence me as a little bit of a wishy-washy 18-year-old, probably any way he wanted. And it was my habit still to go to church, so instead of going to homecoming activities, our InterVarsity chapter, so I was involved in InterVarsity, was going to a Keith Green concert in Minneapolis, St. Paul. We had a bus. I went because there was a young woman who said, I'm going, are you going to come to this concert? And I got on the bus, and she wasn't there. I was been hoodwinked. And so I ended up sitting next to a crazy man who's an apocalypticist and was sure that there was a very good chance, since Keith Green in the 2nd chapter of Acts were doing this concert together tonight, Jesus was quite likely to return right there.
Big if true.
I mean, it would have been a good choice.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't happen. But, Keith Green was in kind of his apocalyptic phase at that point, too, in a way. Anyway, I'm making this story too long. Came back on the bus. My dormitory was an all-male dormitory and very rowdy. The drinking age was 18. And so, you know, it's just, we never had a dorm activity that didn't involve alcohol and its excess. So I went to bed, I woke up the next morning, literally walking over broken bottles and actually laying out bodies and just like all the partying and like excess from the night before. And the strangest thing happened, but I like, all of a sudden in my head, I was getting ready for church and I said, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation. Now, I knew these verses because I had to memorize verses growing up. I could have never, before that point, said that verse authentically. So I think what I would have said was, I'm a little ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, even if I believe it.
Yeah.
And something about that morning, I said, I'm not. And it caused a reflection for me to say, you know, like every good thing, every grace of creation and redemption and family that I knew came from God. And there was nothing to turn my back on, only something to embrace. And so that was kind of a turning point for me. Went off to Urbana in 1979, heard John Stott preach, started reading all of the John Stott books, started reading J.I. Packer, kind of the evangelical top shelf canon at the time. And that really, C.S. Lewis, that sort of nurtured me. And I eventually joined InterVarsity staff, which I did for 18 years, campus staff. Took some classes for fun. I had about 50 credits at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School with no degree plan. I just took them for fun. And they were like, you know, you could get a degree. In fact, most people have one by now. And I was like, well, I don't really care about a degree. I just like it. It's interesting. I'm trying to enhance the ministry I'm doing with InterVarsity. The degree really doesn't matter. You should really reconsider that and get a degree. So yeah, I ended up doing an MA in New Testament at TEDS, had a great New Testament department. And then they sort of said, you should really think about a PhD. So I did a PhD at Marquette. And so kind of as a second career thing, I taught first at Asbury Theological Seminary on their Orlando campus from 02 and then to 07 and then 07. In that 02 to 07, I become an Anglican. So joined the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Central Florida. And then I was sort of ready for a much stranger place called Nashotah House back in Wisconsin, which is where I was from.
Wow.
So, you know, as I said to my wife, you know, I'm qualified to do one job in the whole state of Wisconsin. Like there's one job for me and they're calling. Is that a sign? You're like, should I do this? And by the way, it happens to be our ecclesial affiliation now as well.
Wow.
So I went up to Nashotah House in 2007 and taught New Testament for 10 years. I still do some, a lot less. And then in 2017, we had a leadership transition and I functioned as the dean on an acting and interim basis. And then that turned to something more permanent that I wasn't able to quite get out of.
Wow.
So anyway, was a little too long. It could have been longer.
Well, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you a question. The way I first encountered you, I joked at the beginning that you'll think about atonement and justification for the first time because you've written a lot on Pauline theology, and specifically, obviously, important to Paul is this question of atonement and justification. Before I ask you questions about what Paul has to say about atonement and justification, I wonder if you'd just take 3 or 4 sentences and tell us briefly, what is atonement? What does the word mean?
Yeah. Okay, so it's an English coinage, right? And the English coinage is fundamentally means a reconciliation to God by making some kind of restitution. Okay, so that's the really core idea. People say at-one-ment, and that's actually like etymologically true. And so that's what it means, at-one-ment with God, but always implies some means of restitution by which that takes place.
And how would, before we get to the New Covenant, how would a 2nd century BC faithful Israelite understand the way in which they could be reconciled to Yahweh? How are they thinking about atonement before we get to Jesus?
So that's not as easy of a question as it sounds. And I think that the place to start is to say they're already in covenant with God. Estranged from God is not really their category There are people estranged from God. They're called Gentiles. Okay, but persons of the covenant are already, in that sense, bound to God as their covenant God. But yet they sin, and that the covenant makes a way for restitution from the very beginning, right? And so that would be Yom Kippur, chiefly, and then subsidiarily the daily offer of sacrifice in the temple, or what should, if there is a temple, right? So that would be the fundamental thing, but it's really not quite like what we see in the New Testament, where we're talking about a broken relationship between humanity and God. We're talking about an intact relationship with God that needs, because of human sin, needs restitution, a sort of refreshment, if you will, right? An acknowledgement that there is in that covenant still a interior brokenness. So it's not that simple of a question, nor do I think that atonement is necessarily like the dominant category that it would become in the Christian faith, focusing as it does on the saving events of the death and resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? So in a way, we have a different level, rightfully, not mistakenly, rightfully, a different level of emphasis on atonement.
And what I appreciate about what you said is the atonement is part and parcel of what's happening with the broader category in the Old Testament, namely covenant.
Yes.
Understanding that background is very helpful, I think, getting into the New Testament. Of course, we'll eventually get to Paul, but before we do that, there are the Gospels and the life and work of Jesus. What do we see in the Gospels about atonement? How does the theme of atonement develop from the Old Covenant in the Gospels before we get to Paul?
Right. So, again, not easy questions, really, because one of the things we see in our current theological discourse is maybe even a sense that that's not a Jesus thing until the church reads that back into the death of Jesus, right? And I think that's mistaken, okay? But also, it's not read off the page in such a straightforward, a simple way as maybe one can from Paul and the Catholic epistles and so forth, where it's a little bit more emphatic and straightforward, and most importantly, posterior. Right? You can look back on the death and resurrection of Jesus and understand its meaning in its aftermath. So all of that to be said, it really focuses, I would say, in the Gospels on Jesus' self-understanding as messianic, right? The one who's come to redeem Israel and to renew the covenant and to reign as king. That's what Messiah means. But to do so, predicting, foreshadowing, and I would say even acting toward his ultimate death as a necessary chapter for his messianic reign. Right? So you have to think about the passion predictions of Jesus, which have to mean more than I see the writing on the wall, and this might not end up well. You have to see it in light of his turning his face as a flint to Jerusalem, and knowing that he's going there to suffer and to die, and to be raised from the dead. So that must mean something, that he's doing that. And the chief, but not only interpretive lens for that, are what we call the ransom saying. For, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So in that saying, and again, not only that saying, but especially that saying, we see Jesus looking forward to a salvific accomplishment in his death that he casts in the metaphor of ransom redemption, right? Which recalls Israel's establishment by ransom and redemption as they're made a people of God through the Exodus, right? So it's a reprise of that. Now Jesus embodying Israel in some sense in himself and reprising Israel's life in his death and resurrection, which will be saving for all. Now, not just that, of course, here we are, Anglicans, sacramental Christians. So the reprise of the Passover meal also obviously points in that direction. This is my body, this is my blood, this is the means by which this death, and then your ongoing participation in this anamnesis, this reenactment, this bringing forward of this meal, will unite God's people to their saving Messiah and make us one with him. So the benefits of incorporation into his death and vindication by resurrection will be for all of us. So there's a lot of theology there, but you have to read it from the Old Testament as it reflects on the covenant narrative and Jesus reprising that story.
Yeah, really helpful. And so Paul is an apostle who, all the things you've just said is the source material, if you like. It's the content about which Paul is reflecting and applying this work of Jesus in light of the Old Testament narrative to do with Israel. And he's applying it to very specific circumstances and so forth.
Right.
What's Paul's contribution in the development of this thought of atonement?
Okay. Again, fantastic question. So there's so much that you could say about that, but I would start with this, is the chief important starting point contribution for Paul is that Jesus' death makes him the hilasterion. And the hilasterion is a word for, well, we would translate it propitiating sacrifice, but it's the mercy seat, right? So it's the place of atonement, now used as a metonymy for the act of atonement, right? So he is saying that what happens in the temple is what happens through Jesus. Jesus is that. And thus, and this is a little more Hebrews language, but Paul would say that is a shadow pointing forward, for which Jesus is in relationship, the realization. So what the mercy seat, what the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and so forth, looked forward to, Jesus is its realization. So that said, I think the fact that Paul has to reflect from his Damascus experience on the fact that the Messiah, who must have been a pretender because he died, is now raised from the dead and is thus vindicated by God, was not a pretender after all. And that must mean that whatever we thought a Messiah was, it's somewhat different. So it is necessary to, Luke 24, don't you know, it's necessary that the Messiah should suffer and die. And now Paul comes to that realization. And so Paul now has to reflect on the fact that if it was necessary for the Messiah to die, to fulfill God's covenant purposes for his people, and to renew the people of Israel and to open Israel's doors to the Gentiles, then the human need, the human problem, right, that needs addressing must also be different than Paul, previously thought. What I thought was that we've been insufficiently faithful in Torah observance. And we've given ourselves to idolatry and so forth. And thus we're in exile and in a sort of enduring exile. In fact, the problem must be bigger than that. And it must also be universal, because God's answer is such that sin and the alienation between man and God that's caused by sin is actually at the core problem. It's not a national problem alone. It's not merely an interior covenantal problem. It's a universal human problem for which the only possible answer, apparently, is that God's Messiah must die. And thus, his death must be an atonement that deals with sin. But his atonement that deals with sin is not accomplished merely in his death, but in his death and resurrection. And thus, the death of Jesus is followed by his vindication which when we're incorporated into him via baptism, as Anglicans we would say, we're incorporated into him, his death, it becomes our death, and his vindication becomes our vindication, which is another word for justification.
That's very helpful, and obviously a lot there, a lot of different strings to pull on.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's great. One thing would be, so maybe we could ask it this way. If you asked Paul, what did Jesus' death on the cross and resurrection from the grave accomplish? What does it give us? An answer would be, what does Jesus' death accomplish? You could say, well, we get to go to heaven now. You, I think, would say that's an incomplete answer. How would Pauline theology fill in the answer, what does Jesus' death on the cross accomplish?
Right. So, first of all, I would cast no aspersions on that answer.
Yeah.
Because there is not a greater truth in all of the world. That Jesus' death on the cross makes it possible for us to know God forever and enjoy his fellowship as we were meant to. So I would not disparage that. It's right. I mean, it would be hard to do better than what Paul says, say in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, he who knew no sin. So Christ, who was unacquainted with sin in the sense that it's not that he didn't know it intellectually, he had never participated in it, did not know it experientially, did not do any sin, became sin in some sense, there's ways to take that, on our behalf, for us, so that in him, being incorporated into him, we might have, or become, is what he says, we might become the righteousness of God. So, becoming the righteousness of God is the outcome. And becoming the righteousness of God is not singular in meaning. It means that we receive, in some sort of exterior sense, a gift of righteousness, such that we have a status of righteous before God. But it also means, because it is become the righteousness of God, we are engaged in a transformational process where the righteousness that God always intended for us becomes lived in our lives. Right? So it's a fulsome idea.
Yeah.
Like Romans 8:3 would say that what the law couldn't do, powerless as it was because of human flesh, Christ did for us, becoming a sacrifice, an atonement for sin, to benefit those who would walk not by the flesh, but in the Spirit. So the righteousness that the death and resurrection of Jesus grants us is a righteousness that we become in every sense.
It seems to me, in the past, say, 50 years, you read books on Paul, scholars are less willing to say, well, let's just look at the New Testament or look at the Bible generally and set aside church history and just kind of engage with the text itself, because the debates of the Protestant Reformation, I think, have so shaped the questions that we're asking. And even if we're going to the text and we're being faithful to the verbiage that's there and so forth, the very questions are influenced by various debates. And it seems like Pauline scholars have become more reflective of church history, reflecting the ways in which and trying to be more sort of self-critical of those debates and the ways they've influenced questions. So you're a New Testament scholar, but if you would just kind of put on a church history hat, during the Protestant Reformation, what was gained about atonement, justification, and then how has those debates perhaps truncated the way we're looking at justification and atonement? And then if to make the question even longer, why is it important to reflect upon that?
Wow, okay. How long is this going to last?
We can go.
No, because you really need to ask me at least one easy question.
That's a good point.
I feel that you owe it. Okay, first of all, I want to say I think you're exactly right that there's a little more self-reflection about. I mean, the fancy word is like reception history. Like how did these texts get read? What did people make of them? And understanding that if not intrinsic to their interpretation, not something you should just circumvent. I'm going to totally agree with that. That said, I think that that in another way can go too far. And so there's like it can be a density of a reception history that gets between us and the text and doesn't let us sort of look at it, fresh and, as we would say, on its own terms.
Yeah.
So what the Reformation does, among other things, for better and for worse, and in my mind, much more for better than worse, is attempt, and it can only be an attempt to read Scripture on its own terms. And you can't take off all of your lenses, but you can ask, like, was the reception history of ideas like atonement and justification, were they all felicitous, or were some of them unhelpful? So I think what the Reformation does chiefly, as it concerns justification, is it says, well, the Catholic idea of justification, which made it synonymous with a full-on soteriology, had gone too far. It was probably a conflation error, because justification for Paul has fundamentally to do with a status that we have before God, that is the result of the gift of righteousness that he gives to us who are incorporated into Christ on the basis of his death and resurrection, which we receive by faith. And so the Catholic idea of justification ends up confusing that, in my mind, right? Like, I'm going to have smarter colleagues than me who will disagree with this. I think it ends up confusing the issue by conflating other things as part and parcel of justification, which I think is a misuse of the label, right? So do Christians grow in righteousness and holiness and so forth, what Protestants tend to call sanctification? Absolutely. Does it matter? Is it important? It matters a lot. Is it justification? I don't think so. I don't think that's the Pauline vocabulary for justification.
You used the word earlier, we're incorporate. Incorporation. That seems to me emphasizing union with Christ.
Yes.
You get a lot of things underneath it, subcategories.
Yes.
That is more helpful than trying to make justification the broad category. Incorporation, it seems, is a better umbrella to think justification and sanctification underneath.
100%. That is, like, if there's something that's kind of revolutionized my thinking and even like scholarship in the last 15 years, it's that sort of simple but profound understanding. So in like kind of my Protestant evangelical background, there's just like endless debate about what the center of Pauline theology is. That's a hopeless debate. Like, how would you even figure that out?
Yeah.
You do it like by some ladder of abstraction, or you do word counts, or you favor some texts over other. No, there's no way to do that. But you can see almost as spokes on a wheel that for Paul, Christ in us and us in Christ, as our liturgy prayers say, is everything.
Yeah.
And everything we have, every benefit we have, is derivative of that and impossible apart from that. Right? So what I came to understand is that some of the Protestant, and especially evangelical appropriation of Protestantism, for me, had turned sort of commercial and metaphorically commercial and transactional rather than interpersonal and incorporative.
Yeah.
Right? And that's a really different thing. So if you think, well, faith is like kind of my ATM PIN number that I punch in, and I draw out some grace with it or something, or some salvation, that's really messed up. But I kind of got taught that without being so crass.
Yeah.
But if it's like, no, I'm united to God himself in the second person of the Trinity, so I enter into his divine life and enjoy all such benefits as our Christ become mine by sacramental incorporation into him. That's sort of transformational. Like, literally leads to transformation.
Yeah. Just as you've been really generous with your time, maybe a good closing question would be, we've talked about so many kind of high-level theological and biblical categories. Why is it helpful devotionally, just for our kind of simple piety?
Yeah.
Why is it helpful to reflect upon atonement and justification and think carefully about those categories, about theology, particularly Pauline theology, for devotional reasons?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So I think my answer to that question, I suppose different people will answer it differently, is apart from that, I am always going to think that I must gain God's approval by something that I do, by self-improvement. And I am going to be on a hamster wheel of failure. Or I have been so far.
Yeah.
If I understand that the starting place for my relationship with the triune creator God of the universe is that he did that for me, and I participate in all such benefits merely as the reception of a gift by faith, changes everything. I wake up in the morning, go to bed at night, live every moment of my day knowing God's good with me, and I'm good with God because he's willed it so and so acted to make it real.
Amen. Well, if you have been watching this and you would like to talk more about any of these things, I would love to talk with you. My email is dustin@ascdallas.org. Our guest has been Garwood Anderson. Garwood, thank you for taking the time to do this.
It was fun. We could have done this for hours. And I'm afraid some of my answers almost lasted that long. So.
We'll do it again.
Yeah, it'd be great.
Go in peace.